gonna start this session of democratizing money, reconceptualizing banking. So Phil Armstrong has connectivity problem, and so he can't be here for the moment. And so we're going to start this presentation with Mike Hall's presentation. So I'm going to let Mike, Randeep, and Andrew present you their presentation, their paper. And so Mike, you're the first. So you have the floor, and you can go and start your presentation.
Okay, right. Thanks very much, Olivier. I can just okay. Can you see on the screen my first slide?
Yes, that's all right. Yes.
All right. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I think we're working now. Okay, so what I'm just going to talk about democratizing work in a very broad sense. Really, which is a distillation of my experience as a worker cooperative founder 30-something years ago, and following that some years working as a cooperative development agency worker in Bristol in the UK. And I want to sort of relate that to my experiences then, also to the rest of my working life, really, I suppose, where I've variously been an engineer, a business manager, and more recently into my retirement as an MMT citizen educator or online activist, if you like. So I'll sort of start with, I'll move on to the next slide here that I want to, oops. Right, okay. I want to explain a little bit about sort of worker cooperatives and citizen-controlled enterprises and organizations can take a huge number of different forms with very significantly different legal structures and organizational structures, and also outlook in their ethical view of why they're choosing that particular structure and what the goals of their enterprise actually are, or what their common goals are. And that in my experience of co-ops, probably about a dozen or more co-ops, worker cooperatives. There was substantial variety in those, and I'm talking about here about things like common ownership, for example, common ownership as part of a legal structure. This was a typical thing of the early days of the friendly societies, where basically the assets of the enterprise were intended to be owned in common. No individual members of the cooperative had any rights to the value of the assets, even on dissolution of the company or friendly society. And then there are various other forms. There are companies limited by shares, which cooperatives can use. There are companies limited by guarantee structures, which cooperatives use. And more recently, there are cooperative partnerships, which are not limited companies, more akin to, well, a partnership structure, just with an added section of cooperative organizational rules, you might say. So people have different intent when they start cooperatives, the founders of cooperatives. So really, there's no, when people are talking about worker cooperatives or democratizing work in that sense, in the sense of that kind of structure, there's a huge variation, and I haven't even begun to talk about other employee share ownership structures or ESOPs as they're quite often known. There again, there's considerable variation. They're typically structures that are using limited by shares company type rules, and they can write considerable variation into that sort of arrangement as well as to the rights of the assets of the company and so on and so forth. Then we get on to, now most company legal structures will give a primary purpose, will show a primary purpose to the enterprise or the business, basically to make profit. I mean, that is written into the legal structure of most, if you like, conventional businesses. That's exactly what they do. And anything in terms of written into the article, memorandum and articles of association, which define the legal structure of an enterprise. Anything that's written into there in the way of aspirations for, let's say, sort of green or ethical considerations are really just aspirations. I mean, they're not defined in any legal sense in terms of the goals of the company or organization. So that's to my point there, that in my experience, all forms of worker cooperatives and community businesses and employee share ownership type schemes in companies, those organizations, in my experience, don't really behave any differently in terms of ethical variations or in terms of what they're trying to do, their outlook on society, if you will, is any different on the average from anybody else in society. So you get considerable variation there. So it's not really. So the point I'm making here is that the kind of sort of desires. I mean, the people who are working in worker cooperatives, particularly those who start worker cooperative type structures or community businesses, they have that they are already if you like a niche part among society, who see their working life to have a particular ethical dimension, and they want the structure of the enterprise they work in to reflect that ethical dimension to their life in relation to society as a whole, and that's fine. I mean, there's definitely a role for them to play. But what I'm suggesting here is that it's not a desire shared by anything like a majority of citizens today in society. So that the bottom line there is that in any move to democratize work or try to make worker cooperative type structures dominate the enterprise or business sector of a country, that would be any type of sort of enforcing legislation there would go quite against, I think, the desires of most people from what they want from their employment. Which ultimately is really just about them making a living in a reasonable environment, to support themselves and their families. I mean, that's why people work. So, and also there's a further point here. Next point here on my slide here is the knowledge of organizational and financial management is scarce. It takes real resources to teach and motivation and time to learn. I was one of 4 support workers at a co-op development agency in Bristol, and we gave enormous amounts of personal one-to-one help to co-op starts and also to existing cooperatives in assistance in terms of operating their businesses. And there was only probably, I think at the time, probably a dozen or 15 cooperatives up and running. Some were already in existence when I got there. I think in the few years I was there, I think we started about 7 or 8 cooperatives, most of them quite small, talking about, some of them were even only sort of two members, so a little bit borderline as to, as to how much of a co-op that is with two original members. So the point I want to make here is that any effort to try and sort of convert existing any significant amount of existing businesses or enterprises in a country, it would take enormous real resources. I mean, we haven't even got into the sort of the legal situation of changing legal structures and financial structure of businesses. So, aside from a niche application, which I'm all in favour of, and I really do mean a niche application. I mean, in terms of the sort of GDP turnover, one might expect to see, absolute maximum a few percent of GDP involved in these kind of structures. That's to do any more than that would take enormous amount of effort, and it's something that basically the people are not really that interested in, frankly. In my experience, it's people are interested in democracy at work and the ethical directions involved in that kind of consideration. They're few and far between. Really, in fairness, I think once most people have a job which provides a reasonable income they're happy with and a decent working environment, they're totally happy with that. So I don't see where that's going. Next, how are we doing for time? Oh, I'm running a little bit. So, for some reason, there we go. Okay. So anyway, what I would like to talk about from an MMT perspective is what we can do to empower the labour class, who have basically had a very, very raw deal, certainly in my lifetime, the last 40, 50 years, from the capital owner class, who basically run society and government and media. And that the MMT job guarantee as an automatic stabilizer, a price anchor in its primary function. That's why it's part of MMT. It's because it has that technical function. It's because you're always going to get variation in business cycle variation in the economy, and that does mean inflow and outflow into employment and out of employment. And I think that's going to be ever more true as we move into a sort of a transformation or transition period between totally unsustainable society we have now and one that we absolutely require to have probably within the next 30 years. So there's going to be a lot of change in the labour market in those years, and the job guarantee means that anybody, whether they're in work or not in work, can go and do a job guarantee and get a minimum living wage and work in reasonable conditions in their local community or charity sector. And that fallback position for workers that we've basically never had, I believe will give enormous power back to labour, to workers, that I recall really from when I started, when I left school in 1973. Jobs were pretty easy to get hold of then. The unemployment was low. There was quite a lot going on, and certainly in my field, in engineering, there was the North Sea oil boom, and work was available, and companies were interested in people who they thought had capability, and they would train them. So I think the job guarantee basically is the is the real thing that really will empower the labour class and give them some social and financial security in society. And it will do that far, far more effectively than anything cooperative structures will ever do. Bearing in mind that they have their niche application, in my opinion. So I better move on a little bit here. I'm conscious on the time. So what about the general issue then of democratizing society? I mean, what I've just pointed out is that if a government was to enact job guarantee legislation, that would give the labour class 90% of the population enormous power. They would have a basic living income always available to them, and that would set minimum standards that companies and businesses in the private sector couldn't get around. They couldn't find loopholes around that, and it will ensure that on up the wage scale and pay scales that also people have got decent opportunities, and businesses that are competing for workers and not workers having to go and compete for jobs, and some of them losing out of the as in Warren Mosley's 9 bones and 10 dogs story. So really, we've had universal suffrage for about 100 years. The labour class are 90% of the population. By definition, universal suffrage should always prioritise the labour class interests. I mean, I can't see any. That's just sheer force of logic, isn't it? That should work. If democracy by universal suffrage was working in any sense appropriately and correctly, then priority of the labour class should always be the case. That should always be the outcomes of government. But what we've seen, certainly in my lifetime, most of my lifetime, nearly all of it, is quite the opposite. We've seen that the capital owner class interests, the interests of the private sector business owners and the financial sector have trumped labour interest absolutely over the last 30, 40 years. In the UK, I'm referring to particularly here under the regimes of Margaret Thatcher and on through Tony Blair into the present day. So I think that what the real task and where we ought to be diverting our real resources in terms of trying to improve society and trying to improve the structure and process of a process, but whereby we can make this climate and ecological transition that we need to make in the next 30 years. I think the best use of the real resources is to actually get that universal suffrage to work properly. And frankly, if we can't achieve that, there's no possible chance we're going to get any legislation that gives us any democratizing at work. Anyway, you're not going to get that. So that, to my way of thinking, is the challenge. So I'm running very close to my time here, so I'm just going to say that I've got 7 priorities for action here. And this is really about the process whereby we reform the organisation, our governance of society in the broad sense, because I think it's pretty obvious to anybody that it's in no sense is fit for purpose for the challenges of the next 30 years that we face in terms of climate, the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and very much a social crisis that's even in developed economies like the ones that I live in and most of the people on this panel live in, I would suggest. That's a huge issue, because the climate and ecological crisis also bearing down on those issues. So humanity is facing a crossroads here. We either sort ourselves out and work out how we can govern our societies at these scales of millions, hundreds of millions and billions on this planet, or we're just not going to be here in the next 2 or 3 generations. As I see it, I think we'll just disappear. So I've got 7 priorities for action, and this is relating particularly to this process. So I've got number one, the MMT Mosler specification job guarantee, which has a primary function as macroeconomic stabilizer and price anchor. And in doing that, it also gives more power to labour than cooperative structures will ever do if voluntary unemployment and underemployment still exists in society, alongside whatever democratizing at work we might try and get a government to do or to enact. The second one is that basically government needs to provide all welfare supports in a direct administration to citizens. So no more handing out to private organisations to take responsibility and to measure whether services are being delivered or not, because frankly that's a complete failure. We need government departments. We need people reporting directly to elected officials to take responsibility for real outcomes in delivery of public services. That's the bottom line. The private sector can supply materials, other resources to those services, no problem with that. But the administration and responsibility needs to be under direct government control. And that's to guarantee a minimum living standard for all, and including a universal basic services approach where free education, free healthcare, and so on, guaranteed minimum income beyond that, guaranteed pensions as well, because the mass pension savings is a paradox of thrift, a complete absurdity, and is only a skim off for the financial sector, basically, who require a losing punter for their financial casino, and that's very often pension funds. I'll quickly move on now because I've got a few more here, haven't I? Sorry. Okay. So number three, we need a mobilization plan, as in what we would do during, for example, World War II, where we need to mobilize our real resources to meet very specific goals. These need to be drawn up by scientists, engineers, ecologists, health and social welfare professionals for the 10, 20, 30-year horizons to deliver global sustainability. Academic and professional collaboration, I would think, is the necessity on that. And that's where the brain trust, as you like, needs to lead that process. We need that plan. It's going to be a little bit fluid because we've done very little. And the thing that we don't need is all those people to be bringing in and limiting their proposals and suggestions by the falsity of, oh, this needs to be paid for by some private capital somewhere. That's wrong. Governments have all the money. The money can always be made to fit whatever real outcomes we can achieve. Whatever is physically deliverable is always affordable for governments because they issue money free, gratis, from thin air. That's a fact. So, and what the role for economists here is to use the factually correct MMT framework and take supporting, not leading role, making the macro policy money fit and balance the citizens' personal spending consumption part of the economy to match the real goals that the public sector needs to take the lead on, and using its monetary powers. Okay, now, the biggest problem I see to achieving any form of functioning universal suffrage governance is the fourth estate, the mass media. The mass media decide who political candidates are. They basically work for the capital owner class in society and work for only a very narrow section of interests, as I see it right now. That was absolutely epitomised in the UK 29 general election in the way that the Labour candidate Jeremy Corbyn was just completely smeared by various propaganda means. The media works in collaboration with fifth columnist saboteurs within the Labour Party. It's an absolute joke. So the biggest obstacle that I see to democratizing society as a whole is mainstream mass media. So I've got an answer for that. I've got a solution. My solution is to use a citizens voucher commons model for political funding. And this incidentally, and this basically enables a section of media which won't need private capital funding, won't need private sector advertising to basically to provide media output, media commentary in society. And this is also coming back to our point about democratizing work and niche opportunities for cooperatives. I would absolutely see this as a perfect niche application for worker cooperatives, collectives to undertake, because it has a huge ethical dimension. So those are my, if you like, seven bottom line priorities that we need to organize. So I think I've already run over time, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mike?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah. Apologies for my late arrival. I did my checks at home, but unfortunately the college where I'm now has some sort of wall, so that took me a little while to get in. I did catch your presentation, Mike. That's absolutely fantastic. It'll be a great deal of stimulation, I hope, for the people watching or listening. Obviously, I'm going to introduce the second speaker, Andrew. Andrew's got a different background to economics, which is kind of a relief to many people. He comes out of marine geology and oceanography. And just in recent years, he's got the MMT bug. And as a sort of complement to your talk, Mike, Andrew's going to really talk about how the government actually spends, how the process by which they can bring real resources into use. I don't want to talk for too long, so I'm going to hand over now to Andrew to explain the actual MMT-based monetary dynamics. I think Andrew seemed to have disappeared at the wrong moment. Have you got him on your screen, Olivier?
No, he's gone. So I think he probably had a mismaneuver. So I was supposed to show his slideshow. So I maybe prepare this. So when he comes back,
well, he does have, similar to me, he does have issues. So perhaps Randeep, if you're happy, are you able to go next?
That's good. So
okay.
you can go.
Fine. Sorry for all this. My name's Randeep Ramesh. I'm the chief lead writer at The Guardian. I write editorials in the newspaper. Thanks very much for the invite. I would have to say from the outset, I'm not an economist. I'm probably not even a proper MMTer. I don't, I can't say that I have any great kind of knowledge beyond what I've read. But I've always been interested in sort of what might be loosely termed as post-Keynesian economics, or alternative ways of explaining the current situation. Because as Mike pointed out, the paradox is, why, if everyone was in the labouring class, why did they not act upon that? Well, the answer is they're fed different narratives. And as a journalist, that's an interesting thing to view and to challenge. So MMT for me was a few years ago. I was interested just because I'm interested in economics. And I thought there were these mentions of MMT. Now, MMT in the British press is a fairly low level phenomenon, or was until very recently. And so I asked the library at The Guardian to pick out how many mentions there were of MMT in the UK press. I think the first mention was about 2009. It was an FT letter. from an investment manager in San Francisco claiming that Ben Bernanke was enacting MMT, modern monetary theory. And at the moment in 2021, so there are about 240 mentions now of MMT in the British press, as the print press. At the moment, we're running at about once a week is the frequency at which MMT is mentioned in the British press. So, you know, there's definitely something happening. And when it first, if you go back, this is quite a change. So how it started, that should read. This is John Kay, who's quite a prominent economist or economics commentator, describing MMT as a sort of cranky theory back in 2012, and saying that, you know, if the Scottish people wanted cows as their currency, then, you know, what's to stop them from having cows as their currency? It was sort of a traditional kind of poke and a sort of dismissal of an economic alternative understanding. That's all changed now because everybody now writes about MMT. This Philip Aldrich is the economics editor of the Times, quite a respected commentator. He wrote a very good piece actually about MMT. The New York Times, obviously the Americans have a very wider perspective on MMT because of one of its central schools is there. And Julius Baer is obviously an investment analyst who says, you know, are we on the road to MMT? So obviously something's changed in the last 10 years. And that's welcome, really, because, I mean, the narratives that MMT produces are really, you know, a return to an old kind of fight between political economy and economics. In the old days, you know, you had social classes, power struggles. You know, the institutional form of society was relevant to the way that economic outcomes were obtained. And the challenge for that, so that, you know, you can go back, is Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Keynes, I mean, you know, Hyman Minsky, John Robinson, all these quite familiar faces. I got bored of the right wing, of the other side. And the other side sort of posited that actually, you know, we had individuals, there wasn't institutions, and, you know, government get out of the way so the market could work. And that was the tension between the two. And of course, you don't need me to tell you, but since the 70s, the latter side has triumphed. And this quote is Margaret Thatcher's quote, "Economics is the method, the object is to change the soul." And today, mainstream economics, which dominates the political sphere, no discussion in politics seems to be able to carry on without it. And it's dominated by, quotes, neoclassical theories. Those are theories of the latter group of people that I was talking about. That's the Milton Friedman, Hayek's, Alfred Marshall school. And these are familiar to anybody who listens to any debates, you know, that basically in order to get the economy going, you must deregulate and privatize, and government expenditure must be constrained as if we all run a household budget, which must be news to every government that runs a deficit continuously for years and years and years. But still, politicians talk about maxing out the nation's credit card, that you can spend too much. And in the UK, we had this idea that we could all go bankrupt, which recent events suggest otherwise. So what is economics? From a journalist perspective, at least for someone who's been sort of writing about over the years, was that, at least in the last 10 years, it was very much something that disciplined you. The current kind of narrative base was the idea that, you know, don't ask too many questions, stick within the framework. But what we've seen, obviously, is that mainstream economics has failed to understand and explain what's been going on, whether that's a great financial crash, the response to it with austerity, the eurozone crisis, COVID. And what you get from that is mainstream economics doesn't sort of deal with new things. It's just designed to sort of prop up and clear up all the problems associated with the status quo. The problem is those problems have got to the stage where economists themselves have started to question the paradigm. And that's a sort of turning point. At least that's my sort of thesis. And we'll get on to whether the media is capable of dealing with that. And so going back to 2008, the great financial crash, the Queen asked a group of economists at the LSE in October 2008, you know, why did no one see this crash coming? And Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, in his book Money and Government, says if you look through the footnotes, actually there was a group of people, or more accurately, the question by the Queen was, why did no one in mainstream economics see it coming? Because a number of economists outside the mainstream, and he names them, William Black, Stephen Keen, Randall Wray, and James Galbraith, understood that crash was coming and predicted it. And it's telling that all those people are associated now with MMT. William Black, Randall Wray obviously is one of the founders of MMT. William Black, a lawyer who's associated with the Kansas School, which Randall Wray is part of. James Galbraith, obviously, famously has written in defense. And Stephen Keen is a follower of Hyman Minsky and has, as far as I understand it, sort of promoted MMT idea. So, you got a sense back then that, okay, maybe there was another explanation that would have more success with dealing with some of the problems that are coming. That wasn't what the media suggested. And this is partly, about a paradigm discovering what it expects to discover. So, because if you believe everything's a household budget and you're spending too much, then what you have to do is cut back on spending. And so there's Nick Clegg in 2009 saying Britain needs savage cuts. And then you had 20 economists writing to the Sunday Times saying, it's time to cut back. Sunday Times, very big newspaper in Britain, of course. These names sort of span the political divide. So Magnat Desai is Lord Desai's, traditionally thought even at that time as a left-wing economist. So it wasn't. And at the same stage, Ken Rogoff, quite famous subsequently, or was even famous then, IMF economist. So it was the same message. Was kind of like, okay, we need to get back to what economics is all about, which is restraining public spending and creating the conditions for private credit creation. So, and I'm afraid to say the media let that pass. Maybe we should give them a pass, because at the time, mainstream economics had just encountered one crash. Okay, so we had a revolution in welfare is what we needed, and we had the idea that people were cheating the system and taking money out for nothing. Unproductive labor was being employed, or we weren't getting a bang for a buck for all these benefits that we were giving people who were, as George Osborne, the then Chancellor, said, leaving while others were leaving home. There were those who were sort of sitting on their backsides at home, sleeping off on a life of benefits. So the trouble was that the idea that austerity would lead to growth wasn't true. And then we had the same response amplified in the eurozone. And to its credit, sort of, at least certain schools, MMT was one of those groups that said that eurozone countries would encounter problems. And it did so because these countries did not have a sovereign currency. And I've extracted this from Bill Mitchell and Joan Muskin's book, Full Employment Abandoned, which is, it's a very good book. But it talks about the fact that EU countries couldn't exploit the powers that issuing a fiat currency provided them. And we'll see why that's important later on. That they didn't bother to do so, or could not do so, I should say, rather, and adopted as self-voluntary restraints, meant you ended up with a lot of problems. This being one of them. This is Greece. The explosion of anger led by cuts and growth of unemployment obviously led to massive strains for eurozone. And no one can sort of say that the EU did not struggle with that. I think it was one of the turning points for many of the European politicians. So then we came, and I'm sorry if I'm rushing through this, to COVID. And COVID presented this is a self-imposed shutdown. This graph was really about what could one do. So the Europeans had put constraints on what they could do. They had said, well, look, we're going to run a very tight ship, and we're not going to spend money in order to bail out unproductive economies, southern economies. They should sort of purge themselves of their problems. Well, that wasn't the case when coronavirus hit and the pandemic hit. And in this country, we didn't say that because it was plainly ridiculous. And what the government did, and this is a graph showing this furlough scheme, was to spend money to support workers who otherwise would have been out of a job and on the streets because of a self-imposed lockdown by the government, for all the right reasons, for public health reasons. And this graph shows the number of workers who's helped. That's the blue line. So there are about 10 million workers who are helped. This accumulative total is the blue line. These are the latest figures from the government. And the cost of that is the red line. And you can see the cost of the support cumulatively it's 45 billion pounds. So the money was found when it was needed. And how was the money found? Because, obviously we would expect, as or rather mainstream theory might suggest, that as the government deficit rose, you would see a rise in interest rates. That hasn't happened, quite the opposite. And it did this is from ONS, it did this by the Bank of England buying up the debt that was being created by the government. So the deficit was essentially being financed. So you can see the Bank of England purchases, you focus on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see the amount of gilts, treasury bonds, are being held by the Bank of England. So the Bank of England is actually financing this to a large extent. If you don't believe me, then you can believe I couldn't find another way of doing this, to be honest. Sorry about this. This is me responding to something Adam Tooze had written. Adam Tooze is a sort of historian who has written lots of books about crisis, very good books. And one of them, he said, Lord Keynes said that we can afford anything. Money's not the issue. And this view was actually reiterated last year by Charlie Bean, who's the deputy governor of the Bank of England, who basically said, yeah, we could buy. The technical limit is when the central bank has acquired all the assets in the world, which was quite a startling statement, I thought. So that there was a realization within mainstream economics that things had really gone wrong for them. And this is what I mean by a turning point. Can things continue in the way that they had gone before? Well, that depends on the media. And, well, the Wall Street Journal, this was its conclusion in January of 2021, MMT theory seems to fit the facts better. There are new problems coming up about inflation and whether MMT would be the answer in that respect for that problem. But it's an interesting conclusion for what is a very mainstream, if not the mainstream, economics paper in the United States to say. Coming back to Britain, how does that help us? Well, let's just say that trust in the media is not high. So it's fallen quite considerably since the Brexit referendum for all reasons that anybody in Britain understands. And also there's a dwindling power of print media, which I don't know if you can see the graph entitled Sources of News shows a drop from in 2013 where 59% of people got their news from print media down to 15%. Against that is the rise of social media. So social media has gone from 20% to 41%. So that's where we've seen a shift. Now, that isn't necessarily good news. I mean, good news in the sense that people are getting news. The bottom right-hand graph, if you can see it, is from Ofcom, which is how much people believe what they read. And newspapers and television do very well. Social media doesn't. So even if you believe social media, you don't believe it as much as you would do if you're reading newspapers and TV. And that's what that rather complicated and colorful graphic is supposed to show. So I think that's a big issue. And then you have the political map of Britain really reflects this. So this is data from Reuters report. which shows you that most people think their class isn't covered properly. And then you have to ask, well, what do people think their class is? Well, 60% of Britons think they're working class. I mean, they're not, but that's what people believe. So it's an interesting kind of dissonance. Most people on the left, rather than people in the center, think they're not represented. And there's this big regional divide where people in the south believe media and people in the north tend not to, North and Scotland. So you can see for all sorts of reasons why the political problems are there for someone trying to construct a message, a narrative that reaches people who are instinctively distrustful, and very good reasons to be distrustful of the mainstream narrative. So what is the alternatives? I mean, I think, and this is I take this quote from Daniela Gabor, who's a very good post-Keynesian economist who wrote a paper saying a revolution is occurring without revolutionaries. And I think that's true. You need revolutionaries. It's what, because they need to change the debate. And people who study MMT know this better than I do about how things are framed, what metaphorical terms you're using. But really, I mean, they share with many other sort of left schools of thoughts the idea that real GDP is not a sign of a successful economy, and that an economy needs to serve different aims: people, nature, environmental sustainability. And if you think there aren't revolutionaries out there, I mean, I go back to Lord Skidelsky actually wrote a pamphlet in 2019 for John MacDonald, then Shadow Chancellor, where he explicitly calls for a job guarantee program managed by the Department of Employment. It's lost. No, the actual report was made, poked fun at by the Conservatives for advocating a 4-day week. But actually, its real revolutionary intent was to smuggle in a job guarantee program. And no one really picked that up, but I thought it was an interesting idea. And in that respect, I suppose he was a revolutionary, or John MacDonald was a revolutionary, and that may be contentious. But I think those are the sorts of things we need. You need parliamentary spokespeople to pick up on the ideas and to sell them to a public who are increasingly skeptical, for very good reasons, of mainstream narratives. Thank you.
Thanks, Randeep. That was really interesting. Any news, Olivier, from Andrew?
I don't see him. I think he has still technical problems.
Yeah. Well, I can do a little sort of short. Okay, I've said, yeah, I can do a short MMT presentation. So maybe for about 15 minutes or so, if you think that's okay. And then if Andrew does get a signal, I'll hold over to him. Is that all right, Olivier, do you think?
You're the president of the session, so that's your decision.
Yeah, I'm only asking you because you're the man that's there to ask. Yeah, okay. Am I able to share my screen? And how are you? Because this is a new thing for me. Or
yeah,
that's
you. You have on the bottom of this black screen, you have a little box with you have like a little camera, a microphone, and then you have a little screen with a red bar on it, and so you can click on this. Then it will ask you what you want to share.
Unfortunately, it says it won't click. It won't let me go from. It won't. You know what? I don't know if you can. Basically, can I send something to you to share?
Yeah. Yes, you can send me. I will try to do so, but it doesn't seem to work on my part also. So I'm really.
Yeah. Because basically, I've got I clicked it. It goes. Then it goes. What do you want to share? And the box with share on it won't light up. It just says cancel.
Oh.
So I'll try again.
I think you have to allow your browser. You have a small box. I think you have to when you click on this, you can. I don't know if it's a.
Try that.
Yeah, Phil.
Can you see that?
Sorry if I just come in and maybe help you. So,
Yes.
Can you see?
oh, there's something coming up now.
It's working.
Phil. Yeah,
Right,
yeah, we
that's
got
good.
it.
Right,
Great.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk. I'm assuming that most of you know a little bit about MMT, so I'm not going to talk too much about the details of it, the sort of background. I'm just going to flick through. You'll all be familiar with the sort of standard narrative that you can see, I hope, on the right. The government's like a giant household. It gets money from taxes or borrowing it, and then, you know, it's therefore financially restricted like households, except on a bigger scale. So Rishi can spend a lot because he can borrow a lot, but ultimately he will have to repay that. Rather in, if you want to use the analogy, you know, someone who is extremely rich and has a massive credit card limit, but ultimately it will have to be paid for. And this is a very powerful narrative. And MMT, obviously, as you'll know, reverses that. And if you ask the question, where does the private sector get the money from to pay its taxes? Well, the government has to provide that money. And that obviously underpins MMT's narrative that the government is the sole supplier of that which is needed to pay taxes or to buy government debt. So obviously, if net government spending is too low, then you get unemployment, depression. And if net government spending is too high, so the government is at full employment, competing for scarce resources of the private sector by bidding up prices, then you get inflation. So, and governments are constrained therefore by real resources, not by money. And you'll all, I hope, be familiar with that. What I think is quite interesting, which I think is quite an interesting, and I'm going to skip through. One of the questions really is, and it's something that interests me, and I'm undergoing a little project on it currently, is, well, what does the government know then? Because you get conspiracy theorists who will say, oh, well, the government, like politicians in a general sense, understand the system and they're all manipulating us. And in this age of conspiracy theories, particularly with COVID and all sorts of things with Trump and things, this is a very popular narrative. You pick it up on social media. My instinctive feeling is that governments, and certainly the vast majority of leading politicians, do not understand the system. They don't employ a useful fiction. As far as they're concerned, government spending is ultimately funded by taxes or borrowing. Even though the sequence, they may well know that the government spends first and tax later, rather in the manner of, you know, us using our credit card in a restaurant and paying for it later. They don't think about it. I have managed to interview a fairly senior politician. When I asked that politician the question, would you know what happened on the central bank's balance sheet when the government spends, and what would happen in the bank of the account holder? His face drained of all colour. He didn't know. He didn't understand the question, to be fair. I then said, would you think any politician would know the answer to that question? And he more or less said, I wouldn't think so. So the question really is, in my opinion, by and large, politicians accept the narrative. Some of them have got a slightly different way of putting it. They would say, well, the government can spend a bit more now because interest rates are low, we can get away with it. Ultimately, we will have to be very careful in how we husband so-called taxpayers' money. That was reflected, obviously, in Rachel Reeves' speech, this sort of unwillingness to understand the system. And that was quite an interesting thing. And I know that time's short, and I feel sad that you haven't got Andrew's presentation because of technical issues. But the one thing I might mention is a little bit about banking, because this is something where people have a vision of how banks work, you know, and the general feeling, of course, is that banks are like funds, you know, they collect money from somewhere, savers or big institutions, put it somewhere in a bank, and then it's then lent out to people that want to borrow it. So ultimately, banks are, if you like, restricted by the amount of money that's deposited with them. And mainstream economists, if they ever model banks, at least before the crisis, they modeled banks like funds, which is totally incorrect. Even their attempts post-crisis in their models are very, very limited in terms of actually modeling banking. And basically with banks, it's a totally different process. Banks are in fact privileged. They are agents of the central bank, and for MMT, central bank is part of the state sector. So banks are agent of government. They have very specific rules in place for them in terms of capital, liquidity rules, and that enables them to create money. And so, if I get the right think about, so how does that happen then? Well, what happens is when a customer goes into a bank, if the banker thinks that the customer is creditworthy, they will give them a loan. That's all the banker has to do. The banker does not ring head office and say, have we got enough money in our fund? They think is, will this person repay the loan? And if they say they would, the bank expands its balance sheet. So they grant the customer a loan, which is a credit for the customer and a liability for the bank. And they have an asset of equal size for the bank's point of view on the asset side of their balance sheet. So that's all that happens. I'm taking a simple example. If the loan is spent, okay, then that bank's balance sheet shrinks because it loses a deposit, the guy spends it, they lose bank reserves, which are, assuming that was the only transaction carried out that day, if the loan was for 10,000 and the guy's bank deposit, that's all he had, 10,000, it would go from 10,000 to zero, and the assets would reduce the reserves on the bank's other side by 10,000. The receiving bank would gain it. But the bank then still has an asset, and that's the loan. So compared to the starting point, it swapped the reserves it had for an asset of a loan. And at that point, nothing's really changed in terms of value for the bank. But if all goes well and the bank finds that its loan is repaid, then it gets its reserves back, plus a few more reserves called interest. And then to balance the balance sheet, the reserves which are coming into the asset side of the bank will be balanced by increased equity on the other side. So the bank's made a profit, it's doing well. If, of course, the loan goes wrong, it doesn't get the reserves back, and the bank's equity will drop. And if the banks, they keep making more and more bad loans, then their equity will drop so low that they are called, and they go into negative, they will be called insolvent. So that's how banking works. And provided the banks actually obey the rules and avoid insolvency, they can keep on doing that process. So banks make loans in the sense that all they do is decide on the creditworthiness of the customer. They don't need to worry about the amount of bank reserves in the system, because if they haven't got enough reserves, they just borrow them. And they can either borrow them from other banks on the overnight market, or failing that, they borrow it from the central bank. And it's not a question of the central bank accommodating it, it's booked as a loan. All right, provided that bank is deemed to be solvent it has the correct collateral, it's obeying all the rules, it just becomes a central bank loan. So the central bank is passive. It always supplies the reserves required for the system to operate. If it didn't, the payment system would crash. The privilege of the central bank is, of course, to determine the overnight risk-free interest rate. And since the central bank is the only place that can give the reserves to the bank, by definition, it's a monopoly and can set the interest rate. So the interest rate is always under the control of the central bank. All right. So any sense you get that we have to worry about interest rates going up or something of that note is all because people don't understand the system. Currently, of course, the central bank decides that it's going to set the overnight rate and allow the market to determine the yield curve. But that's a matter of pure choice, just by simply by the central bank buying unlimited bonds at maturity levels. It can simply determine the interest rate across the whole risk-free spectrum. The fact that it doesn't do that is purely a political choice. So, and the final thing really I would talk a little bit about is the idea that sometimes causes confusion is, well, people think, hang on a minute, can't I just borrow bank money, like get a bank loan, to pay my tax liability? But the answer of that is no. It might look that way, but if you actually drill down a little bit deeper, okay, if you paid, I don't know, £1,000 in taxes using your bank account, you maybe had £1,000 in your deposit account, you would lose that 1,000, yeah. But the tax bill is paid when your bank's reserve account is debited by the same amount. So it's the reserve drain that pays the bill. And if you think of it, if your bank did not have any reserves and had no account, no overdraft account at the central bank, it wouldn't be able to, your tax bill would not be payable. Now, as it happens in practice, if you've got to solve a bank, it has got an overdraft, which means that you don't see that happen for obvious reasons. But the crucial thing is, and the insight of MMT is that when the government spends or lends, it adds reserves. And when you pay taxes or borrow, or the government sells debt and it's bought, then that drains reserves. And it always has to be that way. If it doesn't appear to be so, it's because there's a system to try to disguise it. So bank money, individuals can get loans, pay bills, but ultimately a reserve drain must be required to pay your tax bill. So I would basically, because round off my presentation, which I've just cobbled together at the last minute, basically my opinion is that politicians by and large do not understand how the monetary system works. An odd one might have an inkling, Chris Williamson, I think he's got a bit of an idea about that. And maybe one or two are keeping their heads down, but the major guys, the ones that we see on the TV and the major players, they don't understand it. As has been mentioned by Mike earlier, governments then with their own currency and on the floating exchange rates, it's real, not monetary constraints. If you've got real resources which are available for use, people who want to work but have got no job, the government should increase its net spending. A little bit drawing upon what Randeep was saying, the crucial thing is getting the MMT message out there. I can't profess to be an expert in how that's done. Certainly, governments need to know that they can control their current sovereign currency, that it can't go bankrupt, and they can set interest rates at whatever level. And of course, not true of the eurozone, or generally speaking, that the eurozone are by and large currency users. Now, obviously, Dirk is an expert in that, and he's on the other panel. But obviously, the eurozone has made certain policy adjustments to make sure that, shall we say, the system is circumvented, so the central bank does what it takes and buys government debt, which is kind of in contradiction to their whole treaty, but they had to do that to stop the system crashing. So I think I'm going to stop there and go back to that. So I have now completed my PowerPoint. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Do you want to read the questions out, Olivier, if any come in chat?
Well, actually, there's no question in the Q&A. We had one commentary from Stephen. I don't know if you wanted to comment live and to maybe discuss and ask a question.
Yep. Thanks, Stephen. I can see your comment in the chat. Mike, did you have anything you'd like to add? If there's no questions, any summary of your key points before we maybe wind up?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I would just. I'll just sort of reiterate, really, in much simpler terms, what Stephen Hale the comment has made in the comments there, the chat. Randeep, I think this was a response to something you said there in your presentation. I don't know if you're aware, but this is Dr. Stephen Hale, who's an MMT economist. I
know Stephen. I know.
Oh, you know Stephen. Oh, good. Okay, that's right. Yeah. So, I mean, their advisors don't understand the system, meaning politicians' advisors. I think that's what he's referring to there. The orthodox view baked in, blah blah blah. So yeah, I mean, they don't have a clue. And I mean, the point I'd like to make is that those politicians from candidacy forward are basically selected by mainstream media. I mean, that's who publicises them. That's the whole game, isn't it? The whole game is on media. And unfortunately, I mean, I've got to speak about. I don't want to get at you here because I know you're kind of doing things at the Guardian there, and you're you're making a reasonable effort to be curious about MMT and what it's got to say. But the UK media as a whole is basically a monoculture, and I'm afraid even your own publication, most economics commentary comes from the business section in all the UK media, TV. I mean, it's Helia Ibrahimi on Channel 4 the other night, and they're all the same. They're saying, "Oh yeah, well, government's got to borrow," but that's factually wrong. I mean, this is not opinion. This is fake news. It's factually wrong. The government doesn't need to borrow, and it's proved that during the COVID crisis. 450 billions. Just to say, right, okay, well, we'll just hand that money out in the Ways and Means account at the Bank of England. The Bank of England, of course, is wholly owned and controlled by the government. It's basically the government. The Bank of England isn't separate to the government. It is the government. So, I mean, these are facts. These are not opinions. These are facts. And I think my observation of it is, I saw your chart earlier. 250 mentions. I presume that was annually, because I ain't seen that.
It's cumulatively. So at the bottom of that chart,
it's cumulative. Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
The bottom of the chart says that it's one mention a week at the moment, which is not
right. Yeah, I mean that's just
given.
Well, it's pathetic. Come on. I mean, the business pages are full of every day someone's going to be saying something about whether government needs to borrow or taxes need to rise to pay for something, where there's no link between taxes paying for anything. It just doesn't exist. That's the technical reality underlying all this. Now, I appreciate you're not an economist. You said that, but where are we going to go with this? Because if the status quo continues, it's game over for humanity, Randeep. It's game over. If this situation doesn't change, it's game over, because we will just fluctuate. I mean, there's New Labour offering absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing is changed. And sadly, Corbyn and McDonnell didn't either, but at least Corbyn had integrity. So we might have had a chance of trying to sort of educate Corbyn on the technical facts I'm talking about here of the monetary system. You know, it's just you know, where do we go with this? I mean, this is not meaningful democracy. You know, it just doesn't exist. It hasn't existed, you know, for my whole life. It still doesn't, and it's not going to get us anywhere, because you know, COP26. I'm talking about now about processes whereby humans govern this transformation that we all know we need. I'm sure you accept that. The processes whereby humans govern the transition that we need, and it's just, you know, with the present situation, COP26 it's not going to do anything. You know, the present institutional structure and process not fit for purpose at all. You know, media is the biggest part of why that won't change. You know, unless media changes, unless the media sector changes. This is why, you know, I'm saying, well, okay, you know, traditional mainstream mass media, you carry on, but government has the means of production of money. Here, coming back to the democratizing thing and the only means of production theme of this whole forum. You know, so government can provide citizens' media vouchers to every citizen in the UK, and they can subscribe to the media they want. Now, I know
Mike,
people
sorry,
say to me, oh, well...
Can I be rude and interrupt you, Mike? I'm keeping an eye on the time. You're giving us I agree with a lot of things you say. I just feel that looking at the clock, I might give Randeep a chance to respond. And I would have to say, in Randeep's defense, he's probably...
Well, I'm not getting at him personally.
Praise him. I'm just going to say he's the most open-minded journalist to heterodox ideas I've ever met. So, but I know you feel really passionately about all these things, Mike. So I might let Randeep just give a little response to that, you know. So thanks, Mike, for giving us the thoughts. Sorry, Randeep, I'll hand over to you.
That's okay. I mean, you know, these things are felt passionately, and why not have a debate? I have to say, when I was at Low-Pi conference, I'm self-isolating at the moment, so I'm not at the Tories. So, but I was just introduced in many occasions as the MMT guy, and which you know, I can't claim to be, because I'm not an expert. I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist. And like I think Phil and yourself, Mike, you know, I did physics as my first degree. I was an engineer after that. I did my master's in engineering, petrophysics. So, I mean, I worked in the oil industry. It's not like I didn't do anything else beforehand. And I'm not particularly scared of numbers or, you know, equations or anything else, to be honest. I was interested only because it's a battle of ideas, and I don't think you can... there's no sort of purity that will win over your audience. There's no amount of saying you are right. You have to convince people. And that's where you can actually hold a narrative. You can breach it so it sinks. And that's kind of what I'm suggesting in my talk is if you just say that you have the answer, that's, you know, that's a kind of messiah complex. Well, that isn't going to convince everyone. Might convince the converted, but it won't convince everyone. And you need constantly to be able to reframe your arguments so they meet the moment, so they meet the challenge presented by the alternative, the mainstream view. And I think that's kind of what I would suggest. And actually, just in those conversations I had where people would, you know, one sort of former Corbyn advisor who sort of made a joke of me saying this, when I sat down with many of the heterodox economists around that table, we were all having dinner together, and I sort of gave an explanation of why I thought MMT in rhetoric does what it does. Everyone nodded their head and accepted it. There was no real difference. I think when it gets to the technical issues, there are differences, just as there are in academia between, Marxists and Keynesians and post-Keynesians, and the narcissism of small differences is alive and well in academia. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about changing the political narrative, because that's what we're trying. That's kind of anyone who's interested in heterodox theory must be saying, well, the current prevailing understanding of economics isn't a useful explanation of what's going on. Let's find a better explanation. But that requires you to be constantly vigilant for arguments. And that's kind of what I would say a good journalist would be if they were curious and honest about what was going on. And journalists are just ordinary people. They're fallible. They have the same pressures as everyone else, and they struggle because they're having to understand lots of things all the time, very quickly. Social media doesn't help, and neither does a very divisive kind of political atmosphere. I'm not saying that, politics isn't divisive. It is. There's people on one side of the argument, others on the other. So you kind of have to live with that. But I don't know if you could convince anyone by telling them they're just wrong, and that isn't going to work for most.
That's simply a false. That's simply a false view of it. No, I'm sorry. Look, I'll just explain a couple of things, right? Okay. Technically, the UK government is issue of the pounds. I mean, in fact, the mainstream of economics now doesn't deny that. Yeah, it doesn't deny that the UK government can do that. So when they get pushed on this point, they say, oh, well, inflation. Okay. But the media don't do that. The media continue to say, oh, it's the money that we haven't got. The money we must borrow, we must obtain from taxpayers. That's the media narrative. Yeah. So they've got these two things that the mainstream of economics actually say, well, yeah, government is the issue of pounds. It can do it. But inflation. So what we need from the media, logically, if the media was honest and operated a level playing field for new ideas, or for some genuine contest of ideas, the narrative should move on to, well, what about the inflation then? That should be the narrative. You see what I'm saying here? Now it comes back to, on your point, it comes back to what Chomsky said to Ma, way back decades ago. Chomsky said, well, look, if nobody has to tell you what to say, Mr. Ma, because if you thought any different, you wouldn't be sitting where you are. And that is the situation, unfortunately, now with mass media. So this citizens voucher thing is something that really could change that. It would provide a process and a path for curious journalists who really want to get to the honesty and the facts and base their narratives and their writings on facts. It would give them an opportunity to build and grow an audience for that, because it's mass media is run by big money advertising. We all know that. The BBC is just a clone. It's it's organised by government who are putting Tory placemen in charge of it. Anyway, sorry, we're closing on time now, so I'll just say that's I mean, I don't know why I can't get much interest from journalists about this idea of saying, well, let's put some money in the hands of citizens to choose, their media. Simple as that. It's not about excluding the mainstream media as it stands now. It's about providing this extra saying, well, let citizens decide who they want to hear, who they want to, provide their media narrative, their media commentary.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I don't know if you want to respond, Randeep, briefly, I'm keeping an eye on the clock.
Look, it's I'm sort of in the business of persuasion, if you like, and I'm persuaded by lots of things that I hear in heterodox economics, and MMT is part of that. To the idea that, but that's all, and I recognise that journalists work under a lot of pressures that are, that mean that they perhaps aren't as interested in things as they should be, as much as they should be. I don't know. It's a good voucher idea. Sounds great. I mean, I don't know whether you can force people to spend it. That would be my one problem. I can sort of see that. And I also think the persuasive talents of various PR agencies and corporate entities would pretty soon convince you shouldn't be spending it on, you know, a very good venture like Bristol Cable, but you should be spending it on, you know, whatever the Murdoch equivalent is in the Southwest that would be created in order to suck up some of that e-vouchers.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure. But the point is,
hang on.
Sorry,
yeah.
I mean, you know, but it's an interesting idea. I'm not sort of saying it's wrong. But I do say when you say, well, it's a public monopoly of sterling, I actually don't think that the economists generally have a problem with those. I mean, they probably do in a sort of academic sense, but they're willing to understand a framework and they're willing to understand what's going on, and then they will critique it. So the receptiveness is really about having, as I sort of tried to say in my talk, was having parliamentary spokespeople, having spokespeople who are willing to make arguments that meet the questions of the day. Or one of the questions of the day is now inflation. Is there somebody who can, in Britain, talk about what's going on from a heterodox perspective, an institutional perspective? That may be MMT, there may be another school, and that's kind of what you need. And you need those people to be able to think in public and speak in public and win arguments, be given, and those people need to be given platforms. I totally agree. But I'm not suggesting that anyone on this call is that person. Is that what I'm saying? It's we need to sort of say, well, who's the best person to make that case? Because you need to win it in public, and that requires a certain amount of persuasive ability. That's all. Marshalling facts, developing narratives, finding metaphors and language, framing. Otherwise, I mean, everyone, I think, in the heterodox world agrees, to be honest, about ecological sustainability, about the need to use unused resources, whether that's labor or otherwise, you know, within a sustainable sort of framework. It's just, but how does one roll back 40 years of neoclassical economics? I mean, that's a shared project. That isn't one, you know, it can't be a sectarian thing. And I'm speaking as a sort of journalist, not as, you know, a founder of school of MMT, or, you know, someone who's far more erudite in these matters. And I see Stephen, who is a, you know, great man, is there saying a British Kelton with a bestseller and a platform that comes with it would be very helpful. I agree. I mean, if anyone, I think I've said to him, well, who's the person in Britain that I can talk to, Stephen? Because it's a 13-hour time difference or whatever. So, you know, that's my point. Yeah. I think
that's the wrong. That's not the goal. That's not what I want you to do as a journalist, Randeep. What I want you to do is to roll back 40 years of flat Earth statements, of facts, wrong facts being used routinely every day in the media. That's what I want you to do. Now, you know, I mean, as I say, the citizens e-voucher idea, media voucher idea, is to give journalists like yourself, who have, you know, would like to follow something of that nature in rolling back 40 years of flat Earth fake news, you know, an outlet to enable you to do it, to enable you to, you know, to be funded doing it. It's as simple as that.
Sorry, Mike.
I think this is absolutely. Sorry, yeah.
No.
Sorry,
I can see you really like that citizens voucher idea, and I think that's coming.
I've never heard of Beck.
I'm just thinking we've got a couple of minutes left, and I personally have really enjoyed your little, shall we say, gentleman's discussion with my friend and colleague there, Randeep, and that's very entertaining, you know, and hopefully you two will get together over a glass of something and have a further discussion on that. I hope the audience have enjoyed it. I mean, I know, as you did, Randeep, that we need someone to write like a Kelton version. Stephen has just said, perhaps, Randeep, you could write it yourself. And I think that's true. But a challenge to Stephen is, and Randeep and I have actually said this to each other, what we need here in England, Stephen, is an actual MMT academic in a university. So, you know, I know it's warm in Australia, and if you can't come yourself, perhaps you can send us one of your best PhD students. Obviously, it'd be lovely to have someone in a top university who we could draw on, because that's something we lack. I'm aware there's a minute left. I just wanted to thank Olivier for being our technical advisor. It's been a very, very difficult day. I've been running around trying to find a connection. I just got in. And then, of course, the key speaker, Andrew, who was going to tell us all about his fantastic work, has not been able to do that. If you go onto the Gower Initiative site, you'll find a copy of his work. I don't know if while I'm speaking, Mike or Randeep, you could put a little link to in the chat to Andrew's work from Gower. That would be really good. So thanks again to everyone, and I'll wait and see if the lads can, either of them can find the link. I think it was on long reads at the top. Thanks for turning up, David. By the way, your help is always appreciated. Thanks for supporting me through organising the panel and things like that. Thanks again, Stephen, for joining in. I think he'll be talking to you about your joint project there, Randeep. Anyway, I think I'm over time. I don't know if you were able to find that link, maybe not, but I'll oh, there it is. Well, thanks, Mike. That's the link there. If you want to look at that, have a look. That's one of mine, I think, and there's something there for the one from Andrew. Okay, I'll say goodbye there unless you've got any final comments, Olivier.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, well, all the best for the rest of the conference. I hope I can join in for a few panels, and I hope that the tech works better for the rest of the conference. Well done, Mike and Randeep. You actually negotiated the tech, so
Thank you very much.
Respect to you. See you later, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.